A mean neighbor didn't like a wedding happening nearby, so they called the police. When the police showed up, they acted rough, arresting some people and treating everyone harshly. But something surprising happened when everyone found out who the bride and groom really were. Now, the new couple wants to know if they can get help and make things fair. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on more stories. And write in the comments to tell us where you're watching from. As the sun went down, its warm golden light fell across the beautiful backyard of a big, fancy house in a nice neighborhood. The garden looked perfect, with neatly trimmed bushes and tables covered in flowers. Laughter and happy voices filled the air as friends and family celebrated the wedding of Abigail and Marcus. They were so happy, smiling brightly with Abigail looking pretty in her white dress. She was a smart judge who cared a lot about fairness, and Marcus, a brave FBI agent, stood proudly by her side. They looked at each other with love, making everyone smile as they enjoyed the evening together. Abigail and Marcus had decided to hold their wedding at home, a place that held many of their dreams and memories. Marcus had worked hard to make the yard feel cozy but also open, so their friends and family could enjoy the night. Abigail's parents walked around, proudly telling stories about her growing up, and Marcus's family, who had traveled from far away, laughed and toasted to the happy couple. Everyone was having a great time, not knowing that something was about to happen. A few houses away, Mrs. Rose, an older woman who lived in the neighborhood for a long time, watched the party from her window with a frown. She was known for being nosy and liked to talk about her neighbors. She didn't like seeing a big party with people she didn't know or thought didn't fit in the neighborhood. Angry, she picked up her phone and called the police, telling them there was loud noise and strange people at the house. She even suggested something bad might be happening there. At the police station, the officers listened to Mrs. Rose's call. It was a quiet night, and they were curious to check out the situation in the fancy neighborhood. So, a group of police officers got ready to drive over, thinking they might find some trouble to stop. They didn't know it was just a happy wedding party. Back at the house, nobody knew the police were coming. The guests kept talking, laughing, and the kids were running around playing in the yard. Abigail and Marcus shared a dance as everyone watched and clapped. The whole yard was glowing with lights, and everyone was enjoying the beautiful moment. But then, headlights and flashing lights appeared outside as the police cars stopped in front of the house. One of the kids at the party noticed the lights first, and soon everyone was looking, wondering what was going on. Marcus noticed the shift in mood and gently took Abigail's hand to guide her towards the officers. She looked at him, confused. "What's going on?" she asked. Marcus squeezed her hand, trying to stay calm, though he was starting to feel worried. The lead officer, a tall, serious man, stepped forward and spoke loudly so everyone could hear. "We got reports of a disturbance here," he said, telling everyone to stay where they were. Abigail, always calm and collected, stepped forward to talk to him. "Good evening, officer. This is a private wedding celebration. Is there a misunderstanding?" The officer looked around, frowning. "We've had reports of strange activity and loud noises. We need to check things out," he replied. Marcus, trying to stay calm, said, "Officer, it's just a wedding celebration. We're happy to answer any questions, but there's no need for concern." But the officer didn't look friendly. He nodded to the other officers, who started moving through the crowd, talking to the guests in a way that made everyone uncomfortable. The guests, who first thought it was a mistake, began to feel scared as the officers questioned them. Abigail's parents looked worried, and Marcus's brother, who was a lawyer, tried to explain the situation to the officers, but they brushed him off. The joy of the wedding was disappearing, replaced by confusion and fear. Abigail felt a mix of anger and frustration, but kept telling herself to stay calm. She knew they had to stay polite to avoid making things worse. Marcus stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, a steady presence amidst the rising tension. Despite their efforts, Abigail and Marcus could feel a change in how the officers looked at them, with suspicion instead of friendliness. When Abigail glanced at Marcus, she saw he understood too. This wasn't going to be a quick conversation. It was the start of something much harder to handle. The chapter ends with Abigail and Marcus standing together, watching the officers who seemed determined to find something wrong even though nothing was. As the officers walked through the guests, the party went quiet, and everyone looked worried and confused. The flashing police lights shone on their faces, casting shadows on the once cheerful event. The officers continued their questioning, their voices serious and their questions sounding more like accusations. Abigail took a deep breath and walked up to the lead officer again. "Excuse me, officer," she said calmly. "I know you're responding to a report, but I can assure you there's no trouble here. This is a private wedding celebration and we have all the needed permits. We're not breaking any rules." The officer looked at her with doubt and annoyance. "We'll decide that, ma'am," he said, stepping closer, his hand on his belt to make a point. "We need to finish our investigation, so I suggest you cooperate." Marcus stepped forward too, keeping his tone steady. "My wife is a judge," he said. "We know the law and we know our rights. There's no need for all this scrutiny." But the officer looked at Marcus with a faint, dismissive smile, as if his words didn't matter. "A judge, huh?" the officer said, as though unimpressed. "That doesn't change the fact that we got reports of possible illegal activity here. We need to make sure everything's fine." Nearby, Marcus's brother, who had overheard the conversation, tried to explain again, but the officers didn't seem interested in hearing more explanations. At the wedding celebration, everything was going well until some police officers arrived. One man, who was a lawyer, told the officers that everything was in order and they could check any documents they wanted. But the officer just waved his hand and told him to step back. The officer seemed annoyed and made it clear they didn't want anyone's help. They were in charge. The officers started questioning the wedding guests in a very tough way. When an older guest tried to explain that this was just a wedding celebration, not something suspicious, the officer replied, "We'll see about that." Abigail's father noticed things were getting tense and tried to calm the officers. "Please, officers, there's no need for this," he said, hoping to ease the situation. But the officer stopped him and said, "Sir, step back. We'll decide what's important here." Marcus then noticed an officer patting down a young teenager who had come with his family. The boy looked scared, and he kept his hands up while the officer searched him roughly, making the boy wince. Marcus got upset and shouted, "Is this really necessary? He's just a child." But the officer ignored him and kept searching the boy. Abigail felt even more frustrated when she saw how the officers seemed to target the youngest and oldest people there, as if trying to make everyone feel powerless. "Officer," she said firmly as she walked up to the lead officer, "you have no right to treat our guests like this." The lead officer's face turned serious, and he warned her, "Ma'am, if you keep interfering, we'll have to take action against you." It felt like a threat, and everyone went quiet. Marcus gently placed a hand on Abigail's arm, reminding her to stay calm, even though they were both very angry. Abigail took a deep breath and spoke calmly. "I'm not interfering," she said. "I'm standing up for everyone here to be treated fairly and with respect." The lead officer just stared at her and replied in a low voice, "I suggest you start cooperating, or you might end up in the back of a squad car." Hearing this, some of the guests started speaking up. "You can't do this," one man shouted, while a woman added, "This is harassment." But the more the guests protested, the more the officers seemed to get angrier and more forceful. Some officers began separating the guests into small groups, demanding identification from everyone, as if they were all suspects in a crime. Marcus could feel a sinking feeling in his stomach as he watched. He had handled many tough situations in his life, but he had never felt so helpless. He realized that this wasn't just about authority, it was about prejudice, and the officers seemed to be judging them because of how they looked. Abigail's mother, who was now very upset, reached out to Abigail. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice trembling. Abigail squeezed her mom's hand tightly and replied, "We're not going to let them scare us. We have the law on our side." But even as she said it, she could see the smirks on some of the officers' faces, as if they were enjoying having all this power. One officer started walking toward the house as if he planned to search it without permission. Abigail stepped in front of him and said, "You need a warrant to enter our home, and you don't have one." The officer glared at her, saying, "Lady, don't tell me how to do my job," and kept walking. Marcus quickly moved in front of the officer, blocking his path. "You heard my wife," he said firmly. "You don't have the right to go into our home." The officer's hand moved toward his holster, where his gun was, in a way that looked like a threat. "Step aside," he ordered. But Marcus stood his ground and said, "Not until you respect our rights." In that moment, everyone realized this situation was more serious than they had thought. It wasn't just about a noise complaint, it was turning into something much bigger and scarier. The sky, which had been a soft shade of evening colors, was now dark, only lit by the flashing red and blue lights from the police cars in front of the house. The mood changed from nervous to fearful, and everyone could feel the tension in the air. The officers, now numbering more than a dozen, started acting even more aggressively. The guests who had tried to reason with the officers were now being met with harsh commands and rough treatment, as if the backyard had turned into a dangerous place. Abigail and Marcus tried to stay calm in the middle of all this chaos, but it was hard. Abigail's position as a judge didn't stop the officers. It seemed to make them even angrier. When she reminded them of her job and the rules they had to follow, they just looked at her with mocking smiles. One officer sneered, "Judge or not, you're in no position to give orders," and rudely brushed past her. In one corner of the yard, a small group of guests, including some elderly relatives, had been forced to kneel with their hands behind their heads. The officers showed no concern for their age and treated everyone roughly. Marcus felt his anger rise as he watched his family being treated like this. As an FBI agent, he had learned to stay calm in difficult situations, but this was different. This wasn't a dangerous mission. This was his family being mistreated. Abigail's voice cut through the noise as she continued to challenge the officers. "This is illegal. You can't detain us without a reason." But her words only seemed to make the officers angrier. One officer warned her, "Keep talking and we'll make sure you're the first to go," reaching for his baton in a threatening way. Then, Marcus noticed another officer roughly searching a teenage boy, who looked around 14 years old. The boy was shaking, his hands up, trying not to cry. Marcus couldn't hold back. "Get your hands off him!" he shouted, moving toward the officer. "He's just a kid. There's no reason for this." The officer looked up, his expression cold and threatening. "Back off," he warned. But Marcus didn't stop. He said, "You're out of line," standing tall and firm. The tension between Marcus and the officer was growing, and it looked like a confrontation was about to happen. But Abigail quickly placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, pulling him back. "Not like this," she whispered, trying to stay calm even though her hands were shaking. "We can't give them an excuse." The officer smirked, as if pleased to see Marcus backing down, and gave the boy one last shove before stepping away. The boy was left scared but unharmed, yet the guests' fear and anger only grew. Some guests, unable to hold back any longer, started demanding answers and justice. In response, the officers grew even more aggressive. One officer took out his baton and started moving toward an elderly woman who was pleading for her grandson's release. The The situation was now out of control, and it was clear to everyone that the officers weren't interested in resolving it peacefully. The wedding celebration had turned into a scene of fear and tension, with Abigail and Marcus standing firm, unwilling to back down. The flashing red and blue lights painted the dark sky, and the mood had shifted to one of dread, as everyone realized they were facing something very dangerous. It was a beautiful day, and everyone had come together to celebrate a wedding. Abigail and Marcus were very happy. They had spent years helping others and working hard to make people feel safe and protected. The whole backyard was full of friends and family, laughing and having fun. But suddenly, things changed. A police officer told an elderly woman, "Ma'am, step back," in a mean voice. She was reaching out to hug her grandson, but the officer raised a big stick like he was going to hit her. Marcus saw this and quickly grabbed the officer's arm before he could hurt her. Marcus looked the officer in the eyes and said, "You will not touch her." His voice was deep and strong. The officer got very mad and yelled, "He attacked me!" Soon, more officers rushed over and started pushing Marcus to the ground. They grabbed him hard and held him there. The party turned into chaos. People were shouting, telling the officers to stop. Some of the guests tried to protect each other. The officers didn't listen. Instead, they started grabbing other guests. Abigail, Marcus's wife, tried to get closer to help him, but two officers blocked her way. They were cold and unfriendly. "You are getting in our way," one of them said. "Step aside." Abigail's voice got louder. "This isn't justice," she shouted. "This is wrong. We have rights." Her eyes filled with tears, but she stayed strong. When one officer tried to grab her arm, she pulled away and said, "Don't touch me." The officer looked surprised, but only for a second. Soon they grabbed her wrist, twisting it behind her back, and put her in handcuffs. "You're under arrest," one officer said. Abigail's heart hurt to see her husband, who had always protected others, treated like a bad person. She wanted to cry, but she held it in, refusing to let the officers see her upset. The officers didn't stop there. They began arresting other guests too. Even the kids were scared, pulled aside, and told to stay quiet. The air was filled with fear, and everyone felt trapped, like there was no way to make things better. Marcus, pinned down by two officers, looked at Abigail and whispered, "Stay strong. We'll get through this." Abigail gave him a nod, showing she wouldn't give up, no matter how hard it was. But the night grew darker, and the officers kept coming, treating everyone like they were dangerous, even though they hadn't done anything wrong. The flashing lights from the police cars made scary shadows across the yard. Abigail's wrist hurt from how rough the officers were with her, twisting it too much before handcuffing her. She had always believed in the law, but this felt different. Nearby, Marcus was still being held down, his clothes dirty and crumpled from the struggle. "You have no reason to arrest us," he said. "We didn't do anything wrong." One officer smirked and replied, "You people never think you're wrong." His voice sounded mean and full of anger. Before Marcus could say anything back, more guests began gathering, shouting, "Let them go. This is wrong." Abigail called out, trying to speak to the officer in charge. "Officer, I know the law. You're breaking the rules by treating us like this. We didn't do anything wrong, and you have no right to be here." The main officer's face tightened, and he looked angry. "Ma'am, this is a police investigation," he said. "You don't tell us what to do." He looked at his fellow officers and added, "Just because you know the law doesn't mean we'll do what you want." Abigail took a deep breath, standing tall even with her hands held tightly behind her back. "I'm not asking for special treatment," she said firmly. "I'm demanding you follow the rules." She told the officers they couldn't search the place or arrest anyone without a proper reason. But the officer was done listening. "Take her away," he yelled. "If she wants to talk, she can do it in a cell. Two officers grabbed Abigail and started pulling her toward a police car. They were so rough that she almost fell, but she steadied herself, holding back her tears and pain. As they took her away, she shouted, "You're only proving our point. This isn't right. It's abuse." Marcus, seeing his wife being dragged off, struggled harder against the officers holding him. "Let her go," he yelled, his voice full of desperation. But the officers only pressed him harder against the ground. "Stay down," one officer hissed, making sure Marcus couldn't move. Seeing Abigail treated so poorly, Marcus could no longer hold back. He pushed himself up a little, making one officer lose his grip. The officer stumbled and quickly stood up, pulling out a baton and waving it threateningly. "Stay down," he shouted, but Marcus blocked the baton with his arm, even though it hurt. "We have the right to protect ourselves," Marcus said, his voice full of anger. The other officers saw this and started moving toward him again. Abigail, watching from the yard, was full of anger and fear for her husband. She couldn't just stand there and watch Marcus get hurt, so she yelled, "Stop this! You're violating everyone's rights here." Her words seemed to make everyone stop for just a second. Everything went quiet, but soon the main officer shouted, "Take them all in. If they want to fight, we'll give them a reason to remember tonight." The officers got even rougher, grabbing more guests. The people who protested were arrested. Even kids were taken away from their parents, crying and afraid. Marcus and Abigail were pushed to the ground again, their attempts to stand up stopped by force. Abigail saw an elderly relative being shoved toward a squad car and a child being pulled away from his mother, tears streaming down his face. Abigail's anger grew. "You think you can treat us like this without consequences?" she said, her voice full of pain and anger. "We will not be silent, and we won't be scared." Her words only made the officers angrier. One of them pushed her to the ground again, hurting her shoulder, but Abigail refused to let them see her hurt. She pushed herself up, using all her strength. The situation had gotten out of control. What was once a happy party had become a nightmare. Abigail and Marcus, once hopeful and full of joy, now had to stand up against people who didn't care about fairness. The fight was no longer just for them, but for everyone there who had been treated badly. The chapter ends with Abigail and Marcus standing together, hurt but not defeated. Their eyes shone with determination. They were tired and in pain, but they weren't giving up. The flashing lights from the police cars cast long shadows, and the air was filled with the sounds of crying, shouting, and anger. The officers stared at Abigail and Marcus, but they knew one thing. They would not stop fighting for what was right, no matter what happened next. It was a tense evening. Officers had arrived at a party and thought they were in charge of everything, but they were wrong. Marcus was breathing hard from being roughly handled by the officers, but he looked at his wife, Abigail, and they shared a look that said everything. They both felt they'd been treated unfairly, and they knew it was time to stand up for themselves and others. Abigail was in pain, but stood up tall. She shouted, "You think you can do this without facing consequences?" Her voice cut through all the noise around them. The officer in charge looked at her, clearly irritated and feeling powerful. "I don't care who you are," he sneered. "You're under arrest, just like the rest of them." But Abigail was ready to show her true power. I am Judge Abigail Turner," she declared loudly. "I've been a judge for over 10 years, and I know the law better than anyone here. What you're doing is not only wrong, it's against the law." Her words hit the officer hard, and for the first time his proud look faded a bit. He looked at the other officers, who were now looking worried too. Abigail wasn't done. She looked over at Marcus, who was also standing up, even though other officers were surrounding him. "And this is my husband, Marcus Turner," she continued. "He isn't just anyone. He's a high-ranking agent with the FBI." People at the party who knew Abigail and Marcus were surprised to hear this, and so were the officers. The officers began to look uneasy, unsure what to do now. The main officer frowned. "Your titles don't make you untouchable," he snapped, trying to sound tough again. "This doesn't change anything. You're still interfering with an investigation." But Marcus wasn't scared. He spoke in a calm, strong voice. "You call this an investigation?" he asked. "You came here with no warrant, no permission. You harassed our friends and used too much force, even on children and older people. Do you really think that won't come back to haunt you?" Marcus's words were like a cold gust of wind that made the officers feel uncomfortable. Some of them looked toward the police cars, where guests were still being held. They started to realize they might be in trouble. Abigail took this moment to keep pressing. "Everything you've done here has been recorded," she said, pointing to the crowd. Many guests had been filming the officers on their phones. "These videos are already being sent to the media and our lawyers. You're not in control anymore." The main officer's face turned red with anger. He moved closer to Abigail and whispered, "You may be a judge and he may be an agent, but out here, that doesn't mean anything." Abigail looked him straight in the eye. "We'll see about that," she said. "Your actions tonight will be investigated by more than just this department. There will be consequences." Several people from the crowd started speaking up in support of Abigail and Marcus. "You can't treat people this way just because you're police officers," one man shouted. "Let them go," a woman yelled. The officers started looking more and more nervous. Some of them stepped back and others whispered to each other, their confidence fading as the crowd grew louder. Then, one of the older officers, who looked tired and had gray hair, stepped forward. "This has gone far enough," he said quietly, as if he regretted what had happened. But the lead officer looked furious. "De-escalate?" he said angrily. "They've been resisting us the whole time." The older officer shook his head. "No," he replied firmly. "They've been standing up for their rights and we ignored them. We need to back down." His words seemed to calm everyone, as if a storm had suddenly stopped. The other officers lowered their weapons and let go of the people they'd been holding. The crowd began to calm down, but there was still a tense feeling in the air. Abigail and Marcus stood together, still with their hands tied, but they were unshaken. They had shown not only who they were by their job titles, but who they were as people who wouldn't stay silent when something was wrong. They had stood up against the abuse of power and reminded the officers that they couldn't just do whatever they wanted. The officers began to release the guests, the mood still heavy with what had happened. Abigail and Marcus remained determined, knowing that even though this night was ending, their fight for justice was just beginning. What had happened here would echo far beyond this backyard, affecting the law and what people thought about this kind of treatment. As Abigail rubbed her wrists free from the handcuffs, she felt a mix of relief and resolve. The officers couldn't erase what they'd done, no matter what. She looked at Marcus, who had also been freed, and they shared a look of determination. The guests gathered around, checking on each other and comforting the children who'd been separated from their parents. The scene was calmer, but still full of leftover fear and worry. Many guests kept filming, making sure there was proof of everything that happened that night. Abigail stepped forward, addressing the officers in a voice full of authority. "This isn't over," she said, like a judge giving a verdict. "Each of you who acted wrongly tonight will face the consequences. There will be an investigation, and your badges won't protect you." The lead officer tried to defend himself one last time. "You people were resisting us," he said, though he sounded less sure than before. "We were just doing our job." "Your job?" Marcus replied, his voice sharp. "Your job is to protect people, not to scare innocent people at a private event. You acted on false accusations and let your own prejudices take over. That's not law enforcement. That's an abuse of power." The lead officer's face tightened in frustration. He looked like he wanted to argue, but before he could, The older officer stepped forward again. "It's over," he said quietly, looking at Abigail and Marcus with a serious expression. Once upon a time, a woman named Abigail and a man named Marcus were having a beautiful party in their backyard with family and friends. It was a happy day filled with laughter and joy. But suddenly, some police officers arrived, and instead of helping, they acted in a very mean way. They hurt people and scared everyone at the party, even though no one was doing anything wrong. People were upset and confused about why the officers were so rough. Many of the guests recorded videos on their phones, and soon those videos were shared on the internet for everyone to see. As more people saw what happened, they became angry too. They couldn't believe the officers treated Abigail, Marcus, and their friends that way. News channels talked about it, and people all over the country began to care about what happened. Abigail and Marcus knew they had to do something, so they decided to stand up for themselves and everyone who felt scared or unfairly treated. Abigail and Marcus talked to their lawyers and filed a complaint, which means they officially told people in charge that what happened was wrong. They also asked important people to investigate, which means to look closely at the situation and figure out what went wrong. The officers' actions, like being very rough and not listening, were recorded as proof. Many people came together to support Abigail and Marcus, saying, "This isn't fair." They wanted the officers to be held responsible for what they did and for people to feel safe again. Investigators, who are people that look into situations very carefully, checked everything. They looked at the officers' records to see if they had done anything wrong before. They even talked to Marcus, who had friends who worked in important jobs that helped keep the community safe. One officer, who was the most aggressive, had a history of being rough with people before. This meant he had done bad things in the past, and now more people knew about it. Because so many people were upset, the officers were told they couldn't work until things were sorted out. As more people heard the story, Abigail and Marcus realized they were helping make a difference. People across the country talked about treating others with respect and fairness, no matter who they were. Soon, it was time for Abigail and Marcus to go to court, a place where important decisions are made. Many guests from the party came to speak about how scared they were that night. The videos were shown in court, showing how the officers had hurt and scared people, even little kids and older folks. The videos made it clear that the officers had acted very unfairly. Abigail went up to speak, sharing her feelings about what happened and explaining why it was wrong. Marcus, who worked with the FBI, explained that the officers should have been kind and careful instead of being mean. Because they had both seen how things should be done, they explained how the officers' actions were wrong. They wanted the officers to be responsible for what they had done. The court listened carefully to everything. In the end, the court decided that Abigail and Marcus were right. The officers had acted in a mean and unfair way, and they needed to face the consequences. The police department, which is the group in charge of the officers, had to pay Abigail and Marcus for what they went through. The lead officer, who had been the roughest, lost his job because he did not follow the rules. After the decision, Abigail and Marcus walked outside the courthouse. Many people were there to support them, cheering them on. Abigail told everyone, "No one should be treated unfairly, and everyone deserves respect." Marcus stood proudly by her side, and they both felt happy knowing they had made a difference. Their story became a beacon, or a shining light, for people everywhere, helping them believe in fairness and justice. Though it had been hard, Abigail and Marcus knew they had helped others see the importance of kindness, respect, and standing up for what's right. With smiles and a new sense of hope, they walked hand in hand, ready to keep spreading goodness and fairness in the world. Thank you for watching. If you like this story and want to see more, please subscribe to our channel. That way you won't miss any new videos. Give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed it and share what you think in the comments. We love hearing your thoughts. Also, don't forget to check out the other videos on our channel. We'll see you in the next story.